Hello, biology students. Welcome to week 6 of distance learning. This week we're starting chapter 10. Chapter 10 is all about cell growth and division. The lecture for this chapter is in two parts because section 10.2 is a little lengthy. So we're going to do a portion of section 1 and a portion of section 10.2 today. All right, so as always, when you're taking notes, if you're using the PDF of the chapter 10 handout, print that out. Otherwise, write everything that is on the screen in its entirety. Pause from time to time to fill in the notes. And again, keep your notes organized. If you see an indent or spacing, then follow that pattern. Again, that helps keep the information organized on the paper, which translates into organization of the information in your brain. All right, so what's the big idea for chapter 10? Big idea for chapter 10 is cells undergo cell division to produce new cells. And this process is a highly regulated cell cycle. By definition, every one of us started off as a single cell, one cell. And then that cell divides into two cells, and those two cells divide into two cells, and so on and so on and so on, until you are this magnificent, sentient, self-aware human being that is made up of literally trillions upon trillions of cells, all of which are descendants of that one original cell. If nothing else, marvel at that complexity. All right, so a couple of questions. Why do cells divide in the first place? How does a cell divide to make new cells? One cell divides into two identical daughter cells. Now, we've already covered chapter 12. We know from chapter 12 that DNA replicates itself, and that is an important step that has to take place before the cell itself divides into two. All right, so earlier in the last week, you did an exercise and some assignments on why it is that cells are small. It's something that we've taken for granted because we've known since like 4th or 5th grade that cells are small. But let's not neglect asking the question, why is it that you have to be made up of trillions upon trillions of little cells as opposed to being made up of just a few thousand really big ones? Why don't we see single cells, single-celled amoeba the size of a beach ball, oozing out of the pond and coming after the small children playing in the lawn? Cells, by definition, are always tiny. And we know from the work we did last week that it's really about that relationship between between surface area and volume. Again, just to recap, as a cell gets bigger, the volume, or how much space the cell occupies, grows faster than the surface area. The surface area is the cell membrane, and everything that the cell needs goes through the cell membrane, and volume is how much stuff it needs. So as cells get bigger, how much nutrients it needs and how much waste it produces grows faster than the surface area or the cell membrane, and then the cell's capability to feed itself or get rid of that waste. Another reason that cells are small is what we refer to as information overload. As cells grow in size, demands on the DNA increase, and eventually the DNA cannot keep up. Your cell phones are incredibly powerful devices, powerful computers. However, your cell phone could not remotely manage the search engine requests of, say, one of the Google supercomputers. Another analogy is just think of a city, like a city hall with the staffing size of, say, St. Francis, trying to manage the municipal needs of a population of 500,000 people, a city the size of Minneapolis. So cells stay small because it limits the demands on the software or the DNA. And then the second reason is that larger cells are less efficient at getting stuff into and out of the cell. Larger cells, which means that smaller cells are more efficient. Again, if you have a really, really, really small cell, yes, you don't have a lot of surface area. Yes, you don't have a lot of volume, but the ratio of the surface area to volume on a tiny cell is huge. It's like 600 to 1, 600 units of surface area, cell membrane, to 1 unit of volume of the cell. So tiny cells have a huge surface area to volume ratio, which means that they are super efficient at getting materials in, getting waste products out. Okay, so before it gets too big, a cell divides into two identical smaller daughter cells. DNA is copied into two identical sets before cell division. That's what chapter 12 was all about. Each new cell gets one set of DNA. This is an important concept. A lot of students have a misconception about this. When a cell divides, the whole of the DNA, the entire DNA, ends up in each new cell. Right? Now again, just logically, this should make sense to us. If I have a set amount of DNA and I divide that DNA in half among the two new cells, and then those two cells each divide, and then that DNA in turn gets divided in half, and then those 4 cells each divide into 8 cells, and that DNA gets divided into half. It doesn't take very long, it doesn't take very many divisions before we're down to tiny little bits of DNA. So before a cell divides, you need 2 complete sets of DNA. Now again, the common misconception is that the DNA that you have in your bone cells is different than the DNA that you have in your nerve cells, is different than the DNA that you have in your skin cells. Remember, that one cell that we all started off as, when that one cell, before that one cell divides into 2, the entire DNA is copied. So with a couple of exceptions that we'll get to later on, all the cells that make up your body have all 46 chromosomes that you inherited from your mom and dad. When this DNA is copied and the cell divides, each cell has enough DNA to maintain homeostasis, that internal chemical balance. Each cell stays small enough to maintain homeostasis. Unfortunately, because we're doing this distance learning, we will not be doing this lab. That references the lab that you watched another Mr. W do in the video, where he soaked the agar cubes in the vinegar and they went from pink to white. Just a couple of images of cells dividing. Of course, normally they're not this color. This phosphorescence has been added. The blue here is actually the nucleus dividing. Here are the cell membrane. Here's a couple of other cells dividing here. All right, so cell division and reproduction. We have 2 forms of reproduction. So asexual reproduction, the prefix A in this case is meaning without. So this is production of genetically identical offspring from a single parent. This is effectively making a clone. Now, there are advantages to asexual reproduction. It is simple, it is efficient, it is really effective. We know from our studies of bacteria, binary fission, that is a form of asexual reproduction. We don't have male and female bacteria or mommy and daddy bacteria contributing genetic material and then having baby bacteria. It's just that one bacteria divides into 2. We do also actually see this form of reproduction in the animal kingdom. Now, of course, there are disadvantages as well. And predominantly, the main disadvantage is there's a limit to genetic variability, which means that they're less adaptable to changes in the environment. Occurs in both single and multi-celled individuals, occurs in both plants, animals, and bacteria. So asexual reproduction. Advantages and disadvantages. Here's just a couple of images. Here's just bacteria in the process of binary fission, so one almost done dividing into 2. Here's a plant. This is a kind of fern, and then this is like the underside of a leaf, and then these are the clones here. This is sort of an interesting creature. This is called a hydra. This is like a freshwater jellyfish. You can actually find these in Minnesota in the springtime. So here's the main body. Here's the mouth. And this is named after the mythical 7-headed Greek beast, the Hydra. These are all the arms or little tentacles that grab food and shove food into its mouth. Here's the baby. Here's the genetically identical baby, just kind of growing off to the side of the mama or the papa. And then so what happens then is this would then pop off, and we would have our little baby. This is a genetic copy of this one right here. So again, a form of asexual reproduction. This is a clone of that one. And of course, we have sexual reproduction, where we have DNA that is contributed from two different parents, usually a mom and a dad. So genetically unique offspring from sex cells from two different parents. Advantages. There's tremendous genetic variability. Because half the DNA comes from mom and half the DNA comes from dad, the offspring are genetically unique to the parents, which means that they're adaptable to changes, and this genetic variability is the fuel for evolution or inheritable biological change from generation to generation. Disadvantages is it is costly, it's time consuming. And what we mean by that is biologically. Biologically, it takes a lot of energy. For instance, take the animal kingdom in particular, take birds. Usually it's the males are the pretty, brightly colored, brightly plumaged, showy creatures of the two sexes. The females tend to be a drab brown. That's a form of evolution where the males have evolved to have brightly colored feathers and elaborate courtship dances as a sign of genetic superiority to attract the females. So oftentimes you'll see males do these goofy, elaborate court dances or build elaborate nests, and it's all to attract the female. And oftentimes, female will look over the male, eye up the goods, and decide, nope, I'm gonna go elsewhere. So it is costly, it is time-consuming biologically. It takes a lot of calories. But again, there's advantages and disadvantages to both. And again, occurs in both single and multi-celled individuals. So yes, we haven't really spent any time on protozoa, which are single-celled creatures that mostly live in the water, both salt and freshwater, and they have a both form of asexual reproduction, but they do also reproduce. They are single-celled organisms that also reproduce sexually. So sperm fertilizing egg, no, it does not glow when the sperm fertilizes the egg, and then just some cute puppies there. All right. All right, last slide of the lecture. The beginning of 10.2. So again, we take section 10.2 and we do this into a couple of different parts because this is a pretty lengthy section. Chromosomes. What specifically is a chromosome? I mentioned this earlier. We mentioned it in chapter 12. A chromosome is a bundled package of DNA. And each half of each double-sided chromosome is identical. Chromosomes are long strings of DNA. It's an incredibly thin string. It's remarkable how much DNA you have even inside a single cell. Imagine if I could pluck the nucleus out of one skin cell, and I could take out the 46 chromosomes out of that one skin cell, the 23 you got from mom and the 23 you got from dad. If we unwound those chromosomes, those long strings of DNA, and strung them end to end, you would have over 6 feet of DNA inside one cell. It's incredibly skinny thread, but it's over 6 feet long, and that comes from just one cell. All right, so we know from chapter 20, prokaryotes, bacteria, that they generally only have one single looped chromosome. Eukaryotes, remember these are creatures that have their DNA in a nucleus, so you are a eukaryote, have chromosome numbers of variation. Our number is 46. Nothing special about that number, other than that's the number that you need to know. 48 in chimps, 94 in goldfish, 78 in African wild dog. These are just some random items that are random different species that we put up there with different numbers. One of the things I want to point out is a bigger number does not necessarily mean more complex. It doesn't even necessarily mean more DNA. A goldfish has 94 chromosomes. You only have 46. Well, clearly you are more complicated than a goldfish. The goldfish chromosomes might be really small. It's really less about the number that is meaningful, but what does the DNA code for? What does the DNA program? What does the DNA do? Again, these are just some various numbers. The only one you really need to know is it's In normal human beings, it's 46. 23 from mom and 23 from dad. And again, just to reiterate, to dispel that common misconception, with a couple of exceptions, every cell in your body has all 46 chromosomes, copies of all 46 chromosomes. All right, well, what specifically does a chromosome look like? I'm going to move me out of the way here. I don't need to be looking at that. So here's an image of a chromosome. You don't need to copy this or draw this down, but I do want you to just look at it and study it and appreciate the complexity of how the DNA is packaged. All right, so here's that famous double helix. We know that this is the sugar phosphate backbone. We know that these are the adenines and thymines and guanines and cytosines. So we take this double helix and we wrap it around these 8 protein histone globules, and this is called a nucleosome. So here we have the double helix wrapped around some protein called histones, and that's called a nucleosome. We then take those and we coil them on each other. So here's the here's the double helix coiled and then coiled again. And then we take these coiled coils and we coil those. So then we take that coiled helix and then we loop it back on itself. All right, so here it's, and again, this can be a little confusing. This is one of the chromosomes. So this is one side of a chromosome, and here's the other side of a chromosome. So they crisscross like that. And then in the middle they're joined here in this structure called a centromere. All right, so this half right here is identical to this half right here. So this is a single double-sided chromosome. You have 46 of these in every one of your cells. 23 you inherited from mom, and 23 you inherited from dad. All right, so that's our lecture for today. Don't forget to read the section 10.1 and 10.2 to supplement your understanding, and then answer questions 1 through 14 on the Chapter 10 Learning Guide. As always, any questions, don't hesitate to email myself or Ms. Stiles. I hope that was helpful.